In the dimming light of the 10th century, when Rome stood as a fractured shadow of its imperial glory, power resided not in the hands of distant emperors, but in the iron grip of local dynasties. Among these families, none wielded authority more absolutely than the house of Alberic II of Spoleto, who ruled Rome as princeps et omnium Romanorum senator, prince and senator of all the Romans. His dominion was absolute, his word law, and in December of 955, as his own earthly days drew toward their inevitable close, he enacted a final audacious stroke, the placement of his sole son, Octavianus, barely 18 years of age, upon the throne of St. Peter. The chronicler Liutprand of Cremona would later write that Alberic compelled all the nobles and clergy of Rome to swear that on the death of Pope Agapetus they would elect his son Octavian as pontiff. This oath, extracted under duress and the weight of armed authority, violated every principle of canonical election. Yet on the 16th day of December, as Agapetus II lay newly entombed, the oath was fulfilled. The youth ascended, taking the name John XII to bear it, and becoming the first pope to adopt a regnal name distinct from his baptismal one. The Lateran Palace, ancient seat of papal authority, now housed a prince-pope whose legitimacy rested upon familial ambition rather than spiritual calling. Contemporary sources paint Octavianus as handsome, vigorous, and utterly unsuited for the sacred office thrust upon him. The Liber Pontificalis notes his election with unusual brevity, a silence that speaks volumes. He assumed dual authority, temporal ruler of Rome and spiritual shepherd of Christendom, a combination that would prove catastrophic for both church and city. The year 962 dawned with Rome in precarious circumstances. Magyar horsemen ravaged the Italian countryside, local nobles warred incessantly, and the papacy's temporal domains shrank daily. King Otto I of Germany, having consolidated power north of the Alps, represented salvation or subjugation. John XII, seeking protection and legitimacy, invited Otto to Rome for imperial coronation. On the 2nd day of February, in the ancient Basilica of St. Peter, John placed the imperial crown upon Otto's head, while the assembled clergy and nobility witnessed the rebirth of the Roman Empire in the West. The ceremony was magnificent, steeped in ritual dating to Charlemagne's coronation in 800. Otto knelt before the altar as John intoned the ancient prayers, then rose as Imperator Augustus, emperor and protector of the Church. Beside him, Adelaide was crowned empress, her diadem glittering in the candlelight. The chronicler Widukind of Corvey recorded that the Lord Pope John, together with all the bishops and clergy, anointed and consecrated him emperor and Augusta his consort. Yet within weeks, the alliance soured. Otto demanded formal recognition of imperial rights over papal elections and church lands, the Privilegium Ottonianum. This document, sealed in February 962, granted the emperor veto power over papal elections and suzerainty over vast territories. John, who had sought a protector, found instead a master. The young pope chafed beneath Otto's authority like a stallion against unfamiliar reins. What began as cooperation dissolved into mutual suspicion, then open hostility. By summer's end, John engaged in secret correspondence with Otto's enemies, the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, Magyar chieftains, and Adalbert, son of the deposed King Berengar II. These clandestine negotiations, when discovered, would prove John's undoing. November of 963 brought Emperor Otto thundering back to Rome with an army at his back and fury in his heart. The city gates opened without resistance, whether from fear or invitation, sources disagree. Otto immediately convened a synod at St. Peter's Basilica to examine charges against Pope John XII. The list of accusations was extraordinary both in scope and severity, preserved in vivid detail by Liutprand of Cremona, who served as Otto's ambassador and attended the proceedings. The synod's accusations, read aloud before assembled bishops and Roman nobles, painted John as a monster wearing the papal tiara. Liutprand records the charges. They testified that he had ordained a deacon in a stable. that he had ordained a bishop for money, that he had turned the Lateran palace into an abode, as it were, of riot and debauchery. Specific women were named: the widow Stephania, her sister Anna, the concubine Raineria, all allegedly maintained within the sacred precincts. One bishop testified that John had blinded his spiritual father Benedict, who subsequently perished. Another claimed John had caused the demise of Cardinal Subdeacon John through unspeakable means. The accusations grew more severe. John stood charged with offering libations to ancient pagan deities, of invoking Jupiter and Venus during gaming, of refusing the sacraments and omitting essential parts of the Mass. When Otto's envoys sought John's presence at the synod, the young pope, having fled Rome for the fortress of Tivoli, sent a defiant response. Liutprand preserved his words: "We hear that you wish to make another pope. If you do, I excommunicate you by Almighty God, and you have no power to ordain no one or celebrate Mass." On December 4th, the synod formally deposed John XII, citing both his conspiracy against Otto and his moral turpitude. A learned layman named Leo, who had served as papal protoscriniarius, was elevated to the papacy as Leo VIII, the first time in centuries a layman had been so promoted. February of 964 witnessed an unexpected reversal of fortune. Emperor Otto, confident that Leo VIII held firm control of Rome, departed for northern Italy to address military concerns. Scarcely had his army crossed the Apennines when John XII, gathering armed supporters from Tusculum and Tivoli, descended upon Rome like a storm returning to familiar shores. The city's gates opened, whether through treachery, sympathy, or fear remains disputed, and John re-entered the Lateran palace in triumph. What followed was swift and terrible. Leo VIII fled northward toward Otto's protection. John convened a synod of his own, declaring all of Leo's ordinations invalid and Otto's council illegal. Those clergy who had testified against him faced severe consequences. The Annales Romani record that certain bishops who had conspired against him were subjected to mutilation. Benedict, the cardinal deacon who had spoken most vociferously, lost his right hand. John, the subdeacon, was scourged and exiled. The young pope's vengeance was methodical and complete. For 3 months, John XII ruled Rome once more, his authority restored, but his reputation beyond any possibility of redemption. Then, on the 14th day of May, came his final hour. The circumstances remain shrouded in rumour and conflicting testimony. Liutprand, ever ready to believe the worst, wrote that John was struck down by paralysis in the act of adultery and died 8 days later without receiving the sacraments. The Annales Corbeyenses offer a more violent alternative. John was beaten by the enraged husband of a woman he had taken to his bed, his skull fractured by furious blows. He was buried in the Lateran, barely 27 years old, having occupied St. Peter's throne for 9 tumultuous years. His passing left Rome in chaos, with rival popes and imperial intervention becoming the norm rather than the exception. John XII's legacy was secured not through any spiritual achievement, but as the archetype of papal corruption, a cautionary figure whose very name would summon images of sacrilege and scandal for centuries to come. The early decades of the 11th century witnessed Rome firmly grasped in the hands of competing aristocratic families, each vying to place their kinsman upon the papal throne as a means of securing wealth, influence, and political dominion. Among these dynasties, the Counts of Tusculum proved most successful, creating what historians would term the Tusculan papacy. In October of 1032, when Pope John XIX, himself a Tusculan, drew his final breath, the family moved with decisive swiftness. They installed John's nephew, Theophylactus, as Pope Benedict IX, inaugurating the most notorious pontificate of the medieval era. The circumstances of Benedict's elevation shocked even an age accustomed to dynastic papal politics. Contemporary chronicles place his age at election somewhere between 11 and 20 years. The uncertainty itself speaks to the youth's unsuitability for office. Radulfus Glaber, a monk chronicler writing shortly after, noted simply that a boy of scarcely 12 years was raised to the supreme pontificate through family influence. Whether Theophylactus was barely pubescent or simply exceedingly young for such responsibility, his elevation violated every canonical principle regarding episcopal maturity and fitness. The Tusculan family controlled Rome's military forces and urban strongholds, rendering opposition futile. Theophylactus assumed the name Benedict IX to bear it, and took possession of the Lateran palace. Unlike John XII, who at least reached near adulthood before his elevation, Benedict commenced his papal reign as a genuine child, educated in the ways of aristocratic power but wholly unprepared for spiritual leadership. Peter Damian, the severe reformer who would later chronicle the era's corruptions, wrote of Benedict's household with unconcealed disgust. That wretch, from the beginning of his pontificate to the end of his life, feasted on immorality. Benedict's initial pontificate, spanning from 1032 to 1044, became synonymous with violence, excess, and administrative chaos. The young pope governed Rome through family enforcers and personal cruelty, treating the papacy as his private domain rather than a sacred trust. Contemporary accounts, while occasionally prone to exaggeration, uniformly condemn his conduct. The Annales Romani record numerous instances of violent confrontation between Benedict and Roman clergy who challenged his authority or lifestyle. The reformer Desiderius of Monte Cassino, writing decades later, described Benedict as ruling like a captain of bandits, and noted that the holy place was stained with acts so vile that even speaking of them brings shame. Specific allegations included simony on an unprecedented scale, church offices sold to the highest bidder without regard for qualifications, and personal conduct that defied every principle of clerical celibacy. Peter Damian, never one to mince words, accused Benedict of acts of forbidden union with blood relatives, though modern historians debate whether such charges reflected reality or rhetorical condemnation. By 1044, Roman patience had exhausted itself. The city's noble families, clerical establishment, and common citizens united in rare consensus: Benedict must be removed. In September of that year, an armed faction drove the Pope from the Lateran and installed John, Bishop of Sabina, as Pope Sylvester III. Benedict retreated to family strongholds in Tusculum, gathering armed supporters and plotting his return. The Chronica Monasteri Cassinensis records that, for several months, Rome endured a state of confusion regarding who held legitimate claim to Peter's throne. By early 1045, Benedict IX had reclaimed Rome through family military power, expelling Sylvester III and resuming the papacy. Yet something had shifted within the young pope. Whether genuine contrition, exhaustion, or calculation remains debated. Benedict, now in his mid-20s, expressed desire to marry and abandon the papal throne. What followed represented an unprecedented transaction in church history: the sale of the papacy itself. Benedict approached his godfather, the archpriest John Gratian, a respected Roman cleric of genuine piety and considerable wealth. The chronicler Boniso of Sutri, writing in the 1080s, recorded the transaction with evident horror. Benedict, wishing to marry, sold the papacy to the presbyter John Gratian for a considerable sum. The exact amount remains unknown. Sources cite figures ranging from £1,000 to £2,000 of gold, but the act itself was undeniable. On May 1st, 1045, Benedict formally resigned, and John Gratian assumed the papal throne as Gregory VI. Gregory appears to have acted from genuine reform motives, believing his payment would rescue the Church from Benedict's continued desecration. The respected chronicler Herman of Reichenau wrote that Gregory hoped to restore the dignity of the Apostolic See, which had been degraded by Benedict's wickedness. Yet canon law remained unambiguous. Simony, the purchase or sale of church offices, constituted heresy. Gregory's intentions, however pure, could not purify the transaction's essential corruption. By autumn 1045, Rome witnessed an absurd spectacle: 3 men claiming papal authority simultaneously. Benedict had resumed his claim after abandoning his marriage plans. Sylvester III maintained his legitimacy, never having formally resigned, and Gregory VI held the Lateran, recognized by most but tainted by simony. The chaos demanded imperial intervention. Emperor Henry III, young and zealous for church reform, crossed the Alps in late 1046 determined to restore order. He convened a council at Sutri in December, summoning all three papal claimants to defend their positions before an assembly of bishops and temporal lords. The proceedings, preserved in contemporary accounts, revealed the depth of institutional collapse. The Annales Altahenses record the council's deliberations. Sylvester III was swiftly deposed, his election deemed illegitimate. Benedict IX, present under safe conduct, faced a recitation of his crimes spanning 14 years. Bonizo of Sutri wrote that the emperor declared Benedict unworthy of any clerical office whatsoever and formally deposed him. Gregory VI proved most problematic, personally blameless in conduct but compromised by the circumstances of his elevation. Henry recorded Gregory's own testimony. "I confess I gave money for the papacy." The admission sealed his fate. Gregory resigned, was exiled to Germany, and died in Cologne the following year, accompanied by his chaplain Hildebrand, who would later become the great reforming Pope Gregory VII. Henry installed Clement II, a German bishop, as pope in December 1046, finally providing Rome with legitimate spiritual leadership. Yet Benedict IX refused to accept defeat. When Clement died suddenly in October 1047, poisoning was rumoured but never proven, Benedict emerged from Tusculan exile to seize the Lateran a third time. His final pontificate lasted 8 months, from November 1047 to July 1048, before Emperor Henry's forces expelled him definitively and installed Damasus II. Benedict withdrew to the monastery of Grottaferrata, south of Rome, where he apparently spent his remaining years in genuine penance. The abbot Bartholomew of Grottaferrata later testified that Benedict ended his days in penitence, reconciled to God. He perished around 1055 or 1056, the only person in history to occupy the papacy 3 separate times. His legacy remained one of unmitigated scandal, the Pope who quite literally sold Peter's throne for gold. Rodrigo Borgia entered the world in 1431 at Játiva in the Kingdom of Valencia, born into minor Spanish nobility but possessed of fierce ambition and unusual charisma. His path to power commenced when his maternal uncle, Alfonso de Borja, ascended to the papacy as Calixtus III in 1455. Within a year, Calixtus appointed his nephew Cardinal Deacon, bestowing upon the 25-year-old Rodrigo the wealth and influence that accompanied such elevation. The young cardinal received the lucrative position of Vice-Chancellor of the Church, an administrative post that granted access to enormous revenues, which he would hold for 35 years, accumulating vast wealth and intricate knowledge of papal politics. Rodrigo lived openly as a Renaissance prince rather than a celibate cleric. He maintained a splendid palace in Rome, patronized artists, collected books, and entered into a long-term liaison with Vanozza de Catane, a Roman noblewoman who bore him 4 children, Cesare, Juan, Joffre, and Lucrezia. Contemporary observers noted his striking appearance and magnetic personality. The diplomat and historian Francesco Guicciardini later wrote that Rodrigo possessed great skill in the conduct of affairs, unusual energy, and extraordinary persuasive power. By 1492, when Pope Innocent VIII died, Rodrigo had transformed himself into the papacy's most powerful cardinal, commanding loyalty through strategic favors and accumulated obligations. The conclave that followed was notoriously corrupt even by Renaissance standards. The Florentine ambassador recorded that Cardinal Borgia has purchased the papacy through bribery, distributing benefices, cash payments, and promises of preferment to secure the necessary votes. On August 11th, at age 61, Rodrigo Borgia emerged as Pope Alexander VI. Alexander's pontificate commenced with an extraordinary display of nepotism that shocked even Renaissance Italy, accustomed as it was to papal favoritism. The new pope openly acknowledged his children, a scandal in itself, and immediately set about transforming them into European power brokers. In September 1493, barely a year into his reign, Alexander created his son Cesare a cardinal at age 18, making him the youngest member of the Sacred College. The papal consistory records note laconically that the Holy Father elevated his beloved son Cesare to the cardinalate with appropriate ceremony. Alexander's other children received equally spectacular preferment. Juan, his second son, was made Duke of Gandia and married to Maria Enriquez, cousin of the King of Aragon, linking the Borgias to Spanish royalty. Joffre married Sancia of Aragon, legitimized daughter of King Alfonso II of Naples, and Lucrezia, barely 13, entered into the first of 3 strategic marriages to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, connecting the Borgias to Milan's ruling dynasty. The Pope created 47 cardinals during his pontificate, many Spanish, most indebted to Borgia patronage. Among them was Alessandro Farnese, whose sister Giulia had become Alexander's mistress. Contemporaries mockingly termed Farnese the petticoat cardinal, though he would eventually become Pope Paul III. The Venetian diarist Marino Sanuto recorded with evident disgust that the Pope makes cardinals of whom he pleases, filling the sacred college with his creatures. Alexander wielded papal authority to advance geopolitical aims beneficial to his family and Spain. In 1493, he issued a series of bulls, collectively termed the Bulls of Donation, that divided the newly discovered Americas between Spain and Portugal, laying the foundation for the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. This was no selfless mediation, but rather calculated support for Spanish imperial ambitions that would redound to Borgia benefit. Alexander transformed the Vatican into a court of unparalleled splendor and notoriety. He commissioned artists to beautify the papal apartments. The Pinturicchio frescoes that still adorn the Borgia rooms testify to his patronage, and hosted elaborate festivals that scandalized clerical reformers. The papal master of ceremonies, Johann Burchard, kept meticulous diaries documenting the court's proceedings, and his accounts reveal entertainment that frequently crossed boundaries of decorum. Burchard described one infamous evening in October 1501, subsequently termed the Banquet of the Chestnuts, where courtesans performed increasingly provocative acts before Alexander and his family. His diary records, candelabra were placed on the floor and chestnuts scattered among them, and the courtesans, naked, crawled on hands and knees gathering them up. Such spectacles, while perhaps exaggerated in retelling, reflected a papal court where sacred and profane intermingled with disturbing ease. Alexander's administrative ruthlessness matched his personal indulgence. He sold church offices systematically, appointing bishops and abbots based on payment rather than fitness. The humanist scholar Stefano Infessura wrote that never has a pope sold benefices so openly. When reformers objected, Alexander silenced them. His confrontation with Girolamo Savonarola, the Florentine Dominican preacher who thundered against papal corruption, exemplified this pattern. After Savonarola denounced Alexander as a devil in human form and called for a church council to depose him, the Pope excommunicated the friar in 1497. The following year, Alexander's pressure contributed to Savonarola's arrest, trial, conviction for heresy, and execution. The mysterious demise of Alexander's favorite son Juan in June 1497 briefly prompted the Pope toward reform. Juan's body was discovered in the Tiber, bearing 9 wounds. Giovanni Sforza, Lucrezia's discarded first husband, was suspected, as was Cesare, allegedly jealous of paternal favor. Burchard recorded Alexander's grief. The Pope is plunged into sorrow, unable to eat or sleep. Briefly, Alexander issued decrees promising to restrain luxury and end simony, reforms that dissolved within months. Alexander's final years witnessed his son Cesare's ruthless campaign to conquer the Papal States and carve out a Borgia principality in central Italy. The Pope supported these efforts with papal troops, excommunications of Cesare's enemies, and diplomatic maneuvering. The Florentine secretary Niccolò Machiavelli observed Cesare's methods firsthand and later immortalized them in The Prince, creating a portrait of amoral political calculation that shocked and fascinated Europe. Alexander's end came with surprising swiftness. In August 1503, both Alexander and Cesare fell violently ill after dining at a cardinal's vineyard. Cesare recovered after days of fever. Alexander did not. On August 18th, the 72-year-old Pope expired, likely from malaria. Rome in summer was notoriously pestilent, though persistent rumors claimed deliberate poisoning intended for another and accidentally consumed by the Borgias themselves. Burchard described Alexander's final hours with clinical precision. The fever increased, and the Pope was given extreme unction. He died between 8 and 9 in the evening. Alexander's body swelled grotesquely in the Roman heat, his face blackening, natural post-mortem changes that contemporaries interpreted as divine judgment. The Venetian ambassador reported that the corpse was the ugliest, most monstrous thing ever seen. He was buried hurriedly in St. Peter's, though his original tomb was later removed during basilica renovations, consigning him to obscurity even in that final resting place. The legacy of Alexander VI transcended his individual corruptions to become emblematic of everything the Protestant Reformation would condemn in the Renaissance papacy. Martin Luther, seeking to justify his break with Rome, would point to Alexander as proof of institutional moral bankruptcy. The Catholic historian Ludwig von Pastor, writing in the 19th century, concluded sorrowfully that it is impossible to deny that Alexander's pontificate was disastrous for the Church. The Borgia Pope's name became synonymous with nepotism, simony, and the subordination of spiritual authority to temporal ambition, a cautionary legacy that endures 5 centuries after his controversial reign ended.